Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. So today's video we're going to be talking about dungeons and more specifically tech and science dungeons. So I'm going to be making like 3 video series about each kind of like pairing of the classes in dungeon runs, because you get 3 different ones, and then possibly a 4th one kind of like discussing overall the best champions for dungeon runs if you are somebody that does enjoy getting high up in the dungeons. For me personally, the only reason I actually have recently started to enjoy dungeons is just because you can get really high up in there and you get some really strange, weird, quirky, interesting fights, and you end up with like 100k plus opponents, and it's just fun. When it comes to effort versus reward, I think dungeons is a miserable failure for most part, because it definitely does not reward players nowhere close to good enough to be worth the time investment just kind of like casually clearing it, I think anyways. But yeah, I mean, like, it's not like the dungeons are completely useless, but I think it's one of the least rewarding game modes in this game where to invest your time in. The fact that I play them is largely because of my YouTube channel and the fact that I enjoy difficult fights. I just like finding these kind of strange pairings of nodes and champions, and yeah, just to see how far we can get, but nonetheless. So let's talk about science class. There are fairly few champions you need to be worried about. Science is one of the hardest classes to face up in dungeons, I personally believe, and it all starts with champion like MCOC. MCOC obviously has his annoying auto block, so whenever you are going to be facing MCOC in dungeons, if his PI is going to be extremely high, you don't have much room for error, don't have all that much blocking space, you want to be able to bypass that auto block. Typically that would be in a form of True Strike, so you will probably want to have a True Strike champion that can easily access True Strike, or at least True Accuracy, or Quake. Quake also obviously works against MCOC. Obviously you need to take in consideration what kind of nodes there are on, but typically, yeah, keep in mind that you will need an answer for that guy, because this is one of those champions that can all of a sudden appear as a wild mini boss somewhere in dungeon 7, room 7, and that's it, your run is over, because he is tricky to deal with if you're not prepared to deal with that guy. Second champion we definitely have to talk about is Void. Now, Void in itself isn't the hardest fight. It is fairly tricky. You do need to keep an eye on your combo meter, so on and so forth. But the reason why Void is important is because many of us who try to push in dungeons often do run Suicide Masteries. And Void might not be kind of like the showstopper in itself, but he can be your showstopper if you're not prepared for him. If you are running Suicide Masteries, and if you don't have anybody that's double immune, or anybody that can immediately get rid of those debuffs, you will have a tough time against this guy, just because of Void's attack and health in the later rooms is going to be absolutely immense, and so will be the damage you take from your own Suicide Masteries because of Void's abilities. So definitely keep in mind, if you are using Suicides, you will need a double immune champion or something like Ghost or Aegon that can immediately shock these debuffs off. Other than that, Void is not the most difficult champion. It's not an easy one, but there are definitely trickier matchups to fight up against. And speaking of trickier matchups, it's filled with Spider-Man. So you have Spider-Gwen, you have Miles Morales, you have Spider-Man, which is also one of the mini bosses, and so you definitely do need to be careful of these away champions that are there. You ideally will have some sort of way to counter these evades, whether it is True Strike, True Accuracy, slow debuff, or some other way of evade prevention. But it is important that you are ready to face these champions, once again, because they will be there as mini bosses and you will have to deal with them, and they are not necessarily the easiest things to counter. Same as Wasp. Wasp also has high chance to evade, and you need to be able to kind of know how to play around her. Also, additionally, it's definitely worth mentioning that in later rooms of the dungeons, even a parry is going to take away a lot of your health. So for most of these champions, you do not want to pick champions that rely on their parry, unless it's something like Captain America Infinity War, who can have perfect parries, but you can't take champions that rely on blocking, parrying, block baiting heavies, or heavy countering opponents for kind of prolonged dungeon runs. Aside from that, when it comes to actually the initial fight before the mini boss, Science is not the most difficult class to deal with. You typically have there some She-Hulks, Sentries, Rhinos, Hulks, yellow jackets, so on and so forth. So they are not the hardest opponent compared to other classes, but the selection of mini bosses in dungeon for science is definitely a tricky one to get by. Yeah, so I think that will more or less do for science class. It is definitely one of the harder classes to get around with, just because of how many things you need to be able to counter and you need to keep in mind, and you definitely need to think very hard on your roster selection when dealing with science champions. And now we're going to check out tech champions. Now, tech champions are a fair bit easier. The main mini bosses you typically will see against tech class is going to be like Sentinel and Ultrons. And Ultrons obviously do have their evades. So ideally, once again, you have somebody that bypasses these evades, but these evades are not nearly close to as aggressive as the Spider-Mans and so on and so forth. So when it comes to tech class, the problem there, I think, is quite the opposite. So the mini bosses typically are going to be stuff like Sentinel, Ultron. I'm not even entirely too sure who else is there. Iron Man, Infinity War, and stuff. But they're not the hardest opponents to deal with, especially if you have taken your counters with True Strike and stuff like that. The big problem when trying to push against tech champions in dungeons is the fights that lead up to the mini bosses, just because they have champions like Punisher 2099, War Machine, and a chunk of others that have unavoidable special damage, kind of like the special damage when opponent is like 80 KPI with like incredibly high attack, and they have these special attacks that you can't fully evade, will deal a lot of damage. Now, science class also has Joe Fixit, I believe, but I typically don't see him all that often, and compared to tech class, at least it's just the one champion. You can't dodge the damage completely. But yeah, tech class definitely has multiples of them in form of Punisher, in form of War Machine. I think there's something else there that you can't fully evade, and that is the big problem. So when you go in and try to push against tech class, you either want somebody that is able to comfortably gain power and push people from like below special 1 bar to 2 bars of power fairly comfortably, or you just want a power control champion. That is extremely important if you want to maintain your health in dungeon against these guys. Other than that, obviously you can just take your cosmic champions that are very good at countering robots. Like Medusa is a fairly good option for dungeons, just because she can absolutely destroy the Sentinels, the Ultrons, the Visions, the whatnot. Corvus is excellent option up until kind of like certain number of rooms, because eventually he will start running out of charges and it is going to be increasingly difficult to run him. But yeah, definitely keep in mind that despite kind of like initial look of tech class being extremely easy, it's not. It's definitely not easy to push hard and far against tech class when you have to deal with unavoidable damage from basically just baiting out opponents level 1s in War Machine and Punisher 2099. So definitely do keep that in mind. Aside from that, that will more or less do for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it's also slightly bit helpful for you guys. Let me know what you think. What are your biggest kind of like problems when you're heading in dungeons in these particular days? As I mentioned before, I will be making video about the rest of the 4 classes as well, as kind of like an overall video about which champions are typically more used, better champions for dungeons, and for what reasons. And yeah, I guess that will do for today. Thank you very much for watching the video, and I'm gonna catch you guys later. See ya.